excellent presentation. Will now turn directly to Professor Cass's group and a little briefing on fashion.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Peyton, and today I'll be presenting the final briefing for the Fashion Environmental Accountability Act. Here's an overview of what we'll be covering today. We'll be going through the environmental problem, followed by the proposed bill, our program design and plan for year one, as well as how we'll be measuring success. So let's start off by looking at the fashion industry kind of from the perspective of an iceberg. So at the surface, we see these very familiar parts of fashion that we know, fast trends, affordability, and even sustainability goals that we may see our favorite brands commit. But beneath the surface lies a larger share of the industry's impact, overproduction, poor working conditions, and toxic chemicals used. And kind of at the bottom of the iceberg, we really see two key issues here. And that is the lack of transparency in the supply chains, as well as the unsustainable use of natural resources. Despite this, there are still challenges that exist to regulating the industry. Firstly, the fashion industry is largely unregulated, and so there are very few binding environmental standards that companies have to adhere to. Secondly, there are no common reporting rules, so disclosures are voluntary, inconsistent, and hard to compare. Next, the industry is highly fragmented, and so there are at least 900 major fashion companies headquartered in New York State, and under this means thousands of factories operating under different contexts and expectations. And finally, the fashion supply chain today is highly complex and globalized. So even though companies may be headquartered in New York, it's more likely than not their supply chain and production process occurs all around the world. So to kind of address these challenges, New York has introduced the Fashion Environmental Accountability Act, led by Senator Anna Kells, as an effort to kind of transform the entire fashion industry to make it more accountable for the environmental impact as kind of this transparency initiative. So this bill specifically targets companies who operate in New York, who have a global annual revenue of more than $100 million. And so this is applicable to about 120 companies in New York specifically. And so it sets specific requirements for supply chain mapping, where companies have to map at least half of their supply chain and disclose them annually in an annual due diligence report. This would then have to be independently verified. And the bill also sets up a fashion remediation fund, which you can kind of think of as a penalty mechanism, but also a reinvestment mechanism, where non-compliant companies are fined up to $15,000 per day, and the funds will be used for environmental projects that will target communities and areas most impacted by the industry. So now that we've kind of defined the what and more about the bill, let's go into the how, and this was kind of like our group's plan for the entire semester to kind of develop a program for the first year. So we really wanted to tackle the two key challenges that the fashion industry faces. So we did this through a two-pillar program design. So the first pillar is volume and risk-based supply chain mapping. And what this means is that companies have to map 85% of their tier 1 suppliers facing the greatest environmental and social risks. So tier 1 suppliers essentially means kind of the factories and production partners that fashion companies work with directly to produce finished goods. And so what this really does is that it brings visibility to the most critical parts of the supply chain, because not all suppliers are going to have the same level of impact. And so the second key pillar is that companies will have to focus on dual compliance and reporting, meaning that they have to comply not only with local laws, but also international regulations. So an example that we see on the right is with OECD guidelines and with the zero discharge of hazardous chemicals guidelines. At the bottom, we see the Chinese environmental labeling scheme. So this is if companies are producing in China, they would have to also adhere to the local laws in China. And the goal with this is really to streamline reporting and provide comparability across reporting and different geographies. So who will implement the act? So the Department of State, or DOS, is the primary agency responsible for implementation, and they'll be supported by the Department of Environmental Conservation, or DEC, who provides more of the technical expertise with like environmental metrics and such. And beyond year one, the Attorney General will also be involved to enforce compliance. And so the DOS and DEC will jointly appoint a Director of Fashion Environmental Accountability who will oversee the Fashion Environmental Accountability Task Force. And so you can think of this task force as the main executors of the bill. And so bring together different roles and specialists in legal, policy, sustainability, compliance, and they'll be hired according to their responsibilities within 4 quarters of the first year. And so the total budget estimated for the first year will be at about $2.4 million. And this is really to ensure the necessary support is provided to ensure the effective implementation of the bill. So let's kind of go through what the year one implementation would look like. So quarter one is really the setup phase. So this phase is going to focus on staffing, forming the task force, and for the DOS to really begin drafting reporting formats. Quarter two is the engagement phase. So this is when the DOS will engage in consultations with companies and refine templates, as well as finalize the rules and conduct trainings. Quarter three is when the DOS will review any pilot supply chain reporting, provide guidance, as well as conduct a mid-year interagency review. And finally, the last quarter of the first year is the review phase. And this is really to kind of assess learnings from the first year, update procedures, as well as prepare for the year two rollout. So what does this look like for a company on the ground? So let's take Uniqlo, the multi-million-dollar company, have a huge presence in New York. And one of my favorite companies, now that it's getting cold, I love heat tech. So the first quarter would be for the company to really review the bill, and they may even choose to assign a compliance lead to kind of ensure compliance with the bill and also prep data for reporting. Quarter two is the engagement phase, so this is when they'll be engaging with the DOS to really understand what are the requirements, test the templates, and flag any data gaps that they may have. Quarter three, they may submit a pilot report as well as coordinate third-party verification. And quarter four is when they kind of review everything and prepare to submit the first annual due diligence report that the bill requires. So success can be measured through 3 key indicators that really reflect the core goals of the bill. So the first one is on institutional performance. This is really just making sure that the rule-making deadlines are met and the systems are set up in place. The second indicator is on compliance outcomes, right? So what are the percentage of companies who are reporting, and are they, meeting the required standards that the bill requires? And the third indicator is environmental impact, which ultimately is the goal to measure any reductions in emissions, waste, water use, for example. And so this will all be supported by ongoing performance loops, such as quarterly interagency reviews, as well as public feedback and stakeholder forums. So ultimately, the goal of the bill is really to transform the fashion industry to make it more accountable and environmentally sustainable. So we can kind of think of the impact, look at impact through the lens of the theory of change model, where we can see how simple short-term actions link to longer-term outcomes. So the bill's activities, by setting up the rules, systems, and teams in place, then leads to the outputs of more verified supply chain disclosures. And this leads to fewer emissions, lower pollution as the outcomes, and all of this comes together to create the long-term impact of a more sustainable and transparent fashion economy. And this is also kind of a reminder that the policy is really just the start, and to create true change, these systems need to be able to translate through an effective implementation. Last but not least, I'd love to thank my SOAN team. As you can see, we all come from very different countries, and everyone's brought really diverse perspectives and meaningful contributions to the team. And special thank you to our faculty advisor, Professor Lloyd Cass, for all his guidance throughout this semester. Thank you so much. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. And And I think there was one slide that actually mentioned about fashion remediation fund. So if you could just throw some light on what exactly do you really mean by fashion remediation fund? That looks very interesting, by the way. That's really looking very nice and interesting. If you could throw some light on that.
Yeah, so the fashion remediation fund kind of kicks in a little bit later into the overall timeline. So if I can just show the timeline here. So we only see that the fashion remediation fund kind of kicks in year 3. So this is after companies have submitted their reports and after the bill has kicked in, so companies would have needed to comply by then. So the remediation fund, you can kind of see it as a penalty mechanism. So any companies who fail to comply with the bill's requirements, so let's say they don't submit their due diligence reports, or they violate some terms of the bill by not adhering to, let's say, guidelines like the OECD guidelines, they would be fined up to $15,000 per day. It doesn't say exactly how much each company would be fined. It probably depends on the severity of the offense. And essentially, these funds kind of pool together to form the remediation fund, which will then is supposed to be used in projects to, like environmentally beneficial projects for targeted at communities impacted by the industry.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Other questions?
Thank you for this very impressive presentation. So I have one simple question, which is that you mentioned that under the bill, they have to map 85% of the tier 1 suppliers. So that 85% is of the number of suppliers or the value of, based on the value of the procurement? The 85%.
So the legislative mandate, you're right, is for businesses to map at least 85% of their tier 1 suppliers. But a discretionary area was really that the DOS gets to determine how this mapping should be executed. So whether we want it by volume base or by dollar amount value. So in our program design, we chose to do it both volume based and risk based. So really choosing to map according to the suppliers with the highest risk. So this way we would be able to get visibility on like the areas of the supply chain with the highest risk.
Thank you very much.